On a morning heavy with fog in October of 1823, the people of Charleston County awoke to a discovery that would stain their history for generations. 7 enslaved individuals had vanished from the Ravenscraft plantation during the night. Their quarters were empty. Their shackles lay discarded. And on a desk in the main house, authorities found a single blood-stained document bearing the personal seal of Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft. What was written on that page would later be described by Charleston's mayor as the most deliberate record of calculated human cruelty he had ever read. It hinted at betrayal, ambition, and a kind of cold intelligence that reached deep into the highest ranks of Southern society. For nearly 200 years, the Ravenscraft family spent enormous sums to keep that truth buried. But recently uncovered correspondence has forced the story back into the light. This is the true origin of what history would come to call the Wedding Gift Massacre. And before its end, it would shatter an old dynasty and quietly reshape the balance of power across an entire region. To understand how such a horror could unfold, we must return to where it began. Charleston County in 1822 stood as a living symbol of the antebellum South's ambition. Cotton fields rolled across the land like green oceans, feeding fortunes that built grand homes and funded social rituals modeled after European aristocracy. Among this elite, few names carried as much weight as Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft. A decorated veteran of the War of 1812, Ravenscraft had parlayed military honor into extensive government land grants. He was a man shaped by command. Tall, broad-shouldered, with pale gray eyes and a beard trimmed to rigid precision, he radiated authority without raising his voice. Those who met him sensed immediately that obedience was not requested in his presence. It was assumed. That expectation extended to every corner of his life, including the more than 200 enslaved individuals who labored across his 3,000 acres of fertile South Carolina soil. Unlike many planters who reduced human lives to simple tallies, Ravenscraft kept meticulous records. Each person was cataloged by skill, family connection, temperament, and, most chillingly, an estimated monetary value, updated monthly in accordance with market demand and physical condition. It was this same precision that had built his wealth. And it was that precision which would later be turned inward, with catastrophic consequences. His intended bride, Miss Cordelia Peyton of Savannah, was 23 years old and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never known scarcity. Her family fortune was old, vast, and rooted as deeply in the buying and selling of enslaved people as it was in cotton. Horatio Peyton, her father, had built his empire across multiple states, treating human lives as assets to be traded, bred, or discarded according to profit. Cordelia had been raised within that logic from childhood. When their engagement was announced in the spring of 1822, society greeted it as an ideal union, military distinction fused with entrenched plantation wealth. But beneath the polished surface of formal visits and carefully supervised walks through manicured gardens, something less conventional was taking shape. Cordelia showed an interest few women of her station ever voiced. She asked about crop yields, labor efficiency, seasonal losses, and profit margins. While other young ladies focused on household arrangements and social calendars, Cordelia lingered over ledgers. Ravenscraft, intrigued by her sharp mind, began sharing information he normally reserved for business partners. What he discovered was not simply intelligence, but ambition, cold, analytical, and unburdened by sentiment. Cordelia viewed the plantation not as a home, but as a system. And systems, she believed, could always be optimized. Their wedding was set for October of 1822, and promised to be the social event of the season. Invitations traveled from Virginia to Louisiana. French champagne was imported. Musicians were hired from New Orleans. Even the china was commissioned from England, adorned with the merged Ravenscraft and Peton crests. Yet as the celebration approached, Cordelia made a request that would quietly set everything in motion. During a private dinner in Ravenscraft's study, as thunder rolled across the fields outside, she asked for her wedding gift. Not jewels, not land, not a carriage. She wanted complete ownership of 7 specific enslaved individuals. The request unsettled Ravenscraft in a way few things ever had. The study, lined with military maps and plantation ledgers, suddenly felt smaller as Cordelia laid out her proposal with unnerving calm. These 7, she explained, formed a family unit. 3 generations bound together by loyalty and shared labor. She wanted them transferred to her name alone, legally independent of her husband's authority. Her reasoning, she said, was both personal and profitable. These 7 represent a perfect experimental group, she told him, producing a leather portfolio filled with notes. The elders possessed valuable trade skills. The middle generation included exceptional physical strength and medical knowledge. The children were young enough to be shaped. What she did not immediately reveal was the true nature of her experiment. Through private correspondence with contacts in Cuba and Brazil, Cordelia had learned of plantation management techniques, considered excessive even by Southern standards. Systems of psychological manipulation, controlled separation, punishment structures designed not merely to enforce obedience, but to dismantle family bonds entirely. Ravenscraft hesitated. Her request challenged social conventions that defined marriage and property. Yet cotton prices were volatile, and planters everywhere searched for ways to increase output. If Cordelia's ideas worked, they could be applied across his holdings. Over several evenings, they refined what they called the Peton method. The 7 individuals would serve as test subjects. Their responses would determine whether the system would be expanded after the wedding. Legal arrangements were handled discreetly. Attorney Marcus Bellwether drafted documents transferring ownership and concealing the arrangement from public view. At Cordelia's insistence, the 7 were relocated to a remote building on the plantation, disguised as a textile workshop. There, her work could proceed unseen. By October, Ravenscraft convinced himself this was innovation, not cruelty, a partnership, a shared vision for progress. What neither of them realized was that word of their arrangement had already begun to travel. October 15, 1822, dawned clear and bright. White ribbons adorned the oaks. Carriages filled the drive. Governors, judges, and powerful planters gathered beneath the autumn sun as Cordelia and Ravenscraft exchanged vows. The ceremony was flawless. The significance came afterward. During the gift presentation, Ravenscraft stood before the assembled guests and announced that his bride had requested something practical and forward-thinking. 7 enslaved individuals, chosen for their potential and skill, to be placed under her management. Polite fascination rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others smiled. Few questioned the language he used. What no one saw was the family being dragged into isolation at that very moment, beginning a descent from which none of them would ever truly return. And as the music played on, the experiment began. The celebration lasted 3 days. Music drifted across the grounds long into the night. Champagne flowed freely, and guests departed with stories of elegance and innovation they would repeat for years. To most, The Ravencraft wedding represented refinement and progress, but far from the lantern-lit gardens and laughter, another reality had already taken hold. The building Cordelia had chosen sat nearly 2 miles from the main house, hidden by dense stands of pine and connected by a narrow, winding path. It had once been a simple tobacco drying barn, but by the time of the wedding, it bore little resemblance to its original purpose. Reinforced walls replaced timber planks. Windows were barred and set high enough to deny any view of the outside world. Inside, the space had been divided into small, isolated rooms designed to keep occupants apart. At its center was a chamber Cordelia referred to as the instruction room. It was there that her vision fully revealed itself. The room held restraints and punishment devices far beyond what was common even on the harshest plantations. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. This was not a site of impulsive violence, but one of methodical design. The 7 individuals chosen for Cordelia's experiment were the Kane family, who had lived and labored on Ravencraft land for more than 30 years. Joshua Kane, a skilled blacksmith in his 50s. His wife Rebecca, a seamstress whose work clothed both enslaved workers and members of the Ravencraft household. Their children, Samuel, Mary, and David, were known for reliability and strength. Mary's 2 young children, barely old enough to understand the world they lived in, completed the family. What made the Kanes valuable to Cordelia was not just their skills, but their unity. They supported one another. They endured hardship together. And to Cordelia, that bond was a flaw to be corrected. Her program began with isolation. Each family member was assigned separate quarters and forbidden from speaking to one another except under supervision. Meals were staggered to prevent contact. Any attempt at communication was punished, but rarely directly. Instead, Cordelia imposed penalties on other family members at random, ensuring that guilt and fear replaced trust. Then came misinformation. Joshua was told his son had spoken against him. Samuel was told his father had requested harsher treatment. Mary was told her brothers blamed her for their suffering. These lies were delivered calmly, clinically, as if they were routine observations rather than deliberate manipulations. Over time, suspicion seeped into every interaction. But Cordelia's most cruelly inventive technique was what she called productivity bonding. Family members were forced to compete. Better performance meant privileges. Failure meant punishment, not just for the individual, but for someone they loved. Every task became a moral trap. Every decision carried the weight of another's pain. Winter made the work easier for her. Short days meant longer confinement. Cold seeped through thin walls and thinner blankets. Sleep was deliberately disrupted. Food was measured precisely. Enough to sustain life, never enough to satisfy hunger. Cordelia recorded everything. She documented changes in posture, speech, and eye contact. She noted signs of despair with the same detached interest she once applied to household expenses. And each day, accompanied by 2 overseers sworn to secrecy, she walked the path through the pines to observe her progress. What she did not understand was that her cruelty was not creating submission. It was creating resolve. By January, something had begun to shift within the Kane family. Cut off from comfort, stripped of dignity, they reached a shared conclusion without ever speaking it aloud. Nothing awaited them but endless suffering. Compliance would not save them. Time would not soften their captor. If they were to survive, they would have to act. David Kane, the youngest adult son, became the quiet center of that transformation. Cordelia had targeted him relentlessly, sensing leadership beneath his silence. Isolation and punishment were meant to break him. Instead, they sharpened him. Denied conversation, David watched. He memorized the layout of the building. He learned which doors remained unlocked, which tools were left unattended, how sound carried through the walls. He studied the routines of the overseers, their habits, their weaknesses, and slowly, carefully, he found ways to communicate. A tapped rhythm on a wall, a mark left in the dirt, a glance held half a second longer than permitted. Against every rule Cordelia imposed, the family reconnected. What appeared to her as the erosion of their bonds was, in truth, coordination. By February, rumors began spreading through the slave quarters of the main plantation. The Kane family had vanished. No one was allowed to ask why. At night, faint sounds carried through the trees, screams that ended abruptly, followed by long stretches of silence that felt worse than noise. Martha Washington heard them. An elderly woman who had served as head cook for decades, Martha occupied a rare position. She moved freely through the main house. She listened. She remembered. And when fear crept into the quarters, she began quietly gathering people together. She called them prayer circles. Officially, they were meetings for comfort and faith. In truth, they became places of shared knowledge. Information passed in whispers. Observations were compared. Patterns emerged. Martha noticed the deliveries, medical instruments that did not resemble tools for healing, restraints far more elaborate than whips or chains, supplies that suggested long-term confinement, not temporary discipline. She memorized everything, and she insisted others do the same. Names, dates, sounds, roots. If one person disappeared, the knowledge would survive. As winter loosened its grip, something new took shape among the enslaved population. Unity. Not just endurance, but awareness. The understanding that what was happening to the Kane family was not an anomaly. It was a trial run. Meanwhile, among the white planter class, Cordelia's reputation was quietly growing. Nearby plantation owners requested meetings. They spoke of efficiency and innovation, of discipline refined into science. Cordelia welcomed the attention. It only increased the pressure. The Kane family were no longer just subjects. They were proof. March arrived early and warm. Fields were prepared for planting. Overseers pushed harder. Cordelia declared the experiment nearly complete. On March 15th, she announced the final integration test. Mary Kane's 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, would be taken to work in the main house. She would see her mother every day and never speak to her again. Cordelia believed this would permanently sever inappropriate emotional attachments. That morning, when the overseers arrived to collect the child, they found the family waiting. David refused to move. It was not shouted defiance. It was calm, measured, final. When the first overseer raised his hand, the plan unfolded. What followed was not chaos. It was execution. Tools became weapons. Positions were taken. Movements were precise. Within minutes, both overseers lay dead on the floor of the instruction room. The Kane family did not flee. They waited. Cordelia Ravencraftoft walked the forest path that morning as she always had. The air smelled of early blossoms. The plantation stirred with activity. She carried her notes, already composing observations in her mind. She did not sense danger. When she entered the building, she saw the bodies. She saw the altered room. She saw, at last, what she had failed to imagine. The family stood together, calm, arranged, watching her. David stepped forward. "We've been waiting for you," he said. What happened next was not a plea, nor a riot. It was a reckoning. They showed her the records, her own words, her methods, her plans for expansion. They made her understand exactly what had been done to them and what she intended to do to others. By the time Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraftoft was summoned later that afternoon, Cordelia was dead. But she had not died quickly. What he found in that building would dismantle his world. Every tool labeled, every technique documented, a comprehensive account prepared with care and intention. The Kane family were gone. They had taken nothing but knowledge, and what they left behind was not just evidence of cruelty, but the blueprint of its undoing. When Ravencraftoft realized how far his wife's ambitions had reached, he understood something else as well. This was no longer a private tragedy. It was a threat to the entire system that had sustained him, and the truth, once seen, could not be contained. Within hours of Cordelia Ravencraftoft's death, riders were dispatched from the plantation in every direction. They carried no written messages, only urgent instructions delivered face to face to men whose power depended on silence. By nightfall, representatives of South Carolina's most influential planter families had gathered at the Ravencraftoft estate, drawn not by sympathy, but by fear. What confronted them inside the dismantled building was far worse than rumors of a failed experiment or a violent uprising. The space had been transformed into something resembling an exhibit of deliberate cruelty. Every restraint, every modified tool, every method of psychological manipulation had been carefully arranged. Cordelia's own notes lay organized, annotated, and cross-referenced. There was no ambiguity, no plausible denial. Most damning of all was a written account prepared by the Kane family themselves. It detailed not only what had been done to them, but Cordelia's broader ambitions, correspondence with other plantation owners, outlines for expansion, promises of shared techniques. What Ravencraftoft had believed was a private experiment was, in truth, intended as the foundation for a regional transformation of plantation control. The family had vanished completely. No theft, no destruction beyond what was necessary. Only the evidence remained, arranged with surgical clarity. The men gathered that night understood the danger immediately. If the truth became public, it would not simply ruin one household. It would expose the calculated, collaborative nature of a system that preferred to present its brutality as tradition rather than innovation. A decision was reached before dawn. The official narrative would be simple. Cordelia Ravencraftoft had been killed in a sudden, unprovoked slave rebellion. The perpetrators would be described as captured and executed. The matter would be closed swiftly to prevent unrest. To make that story hold, everything else had to disappear. Over the following weeks, a coordinated campaign unfolded. Local law enforcement, sympathetic judges, and compliant newspapers all played their roles. Witnesses were threatened or bribed. Records vanished. The remote building was dismantled, its materials burned and scattered. The two overseers were memorialized as victims of senseless violence, their involvement in Cordelia's program erased entirely. The Kane family were declared dead, without bodies, without graves, without ceremony. Yet suppression has a way of creating echoes. By late April of 1823, unsigned letters began arriving at abolitionist newspapers in the North. They were detailed, precise, written by someone who understood both plantation operations and the language of evidence. Names, dates, layouts, direct quotations from correspondence between Cordelia and other planters. The letters described systematic torture not as excess, but as design. They arrived at a moment when the abolitionist movement was gaining momentum, and their impact was immediate. The Ravencraftoft plantation became a symbol. not of isolated cruelty, but of an emerging philosophy that sought to refine suffering into a science. The damage spread inward as well. Planters who had once expressed interest in Cordelia's methods began distancing themselves from Ravenscraft-Oft. Business relationships dissolved quietly. Loans were called in without explanation. Merchants demanded immediate payment. Friends stopped calling. By summer, the colonel found himself isolated, his military rank now a liability rather than protection. His plantation, once admired, was whispered about as cursed ground. Among the enslaved population, the effect was even more profound. Word of the Kane family's resistance spread across the region, carried through networks far older and more resilient than plantation owners ever acknowledged. It was not just the act of violence that inspired fear and hope. It was the precision, the planning, the knowledge that systematic cruelty had not broken them, but forged them into something capable of striking back. Martha Washington's prayer circles evolved into something else entirely. Information flowed between plantations. Weaknesses were noted, routes mapped, overseers disappeared, equipment failed, crops spoiled in patterns too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. By autumn of 1823, coordinated acts of resistance were occurring across multiple properties. The incidents were small, controlled, and devastatingly effective. They suggested leadership, strategy, an understanding of the system's most fragile points. Authorities grew alarmed. The Ravenscraft-Oft plantation itself became unmanageable. Guards were hired, fortifications built. Costs soared while productivity collapsed. The cotton crop failed, livestock vanished. Sabotage occurred despite constant patrols. The arithmetic became unavoidable. On January 3, 1824, Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft-Oft stood in the parlor of his decaying mansion, surrounded by furniture marked for sale, and confessed. The confession was not born of remorse. It was calculation. Ravenscraft-Oft understood that his former allies had abandoned him and that the truth was already circulating beyond his control. By speaking first, he hoped to reclaim some measure of narrative authority and perhaps drag others down with him. What he revealed stunned even those prepared for scandal. Cordelia's program had never been intended to remain local. It was a pilot project, funded and advised by planters across South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Names were given, dates, meetings, promises of protection from legal consequences. Sheriffs, judges, political officials, all implicated. The cover-up following Cordelia's death had involved coordinated perjury and destruction of evidence at the highest levels of state authority. But the confession contained something even more unsettling. According to documents Ravenscraft-Oft had recovered and initially concealed, Cordelia had not been killed during the confrontation. She had been taken alive. The Kane family, it appeared, had subjected her to a deliberate demonstration of her own techniques. Isolation, deprivation, psychological manipulation. Not as revenge, but as instruction. Evidence suggested she was made to understand precisely what she had inflicted upon others before she was allowed to die. Her death was not swift, it was systematic. Ravenscraft-Oft also revealed that the Kane family had not simply escaped. They had connected with abolitionist networks and free black communities, providing detailed intelligence about plantation vulnerabilities. David Kane, once dismissed as property, had demonstrated strategic capabilities that plantation owners had never imagined possible. Information flowed north. Resistance activities synchronized. Economic sabotage spread across state lines. The Kane family had become something unprecedented in the antebellum South, a strategic threat. The confession shattered what remained of Ravenscroft's standing. Creditors descended. His name became synonymous with disgrace. By February 1824, the plantation was abandoned. Thaddeus Ravenscroft himself vanished soon after. Some claimed he fled to Mexico. Others believed he took his own life. No record ever confirmed either. But the consequences of his family's actions did not disappear with him. In the North, the Ravenscroft papers became essential abolitionist material, cited in speeches and publications as proof that slavery's cruelty was not accidental, but engineered. In the South, plantation owners faced a growing realization that the very methods designed to eliminate resistance had created something far more dangerous. The abandoned plantation decayed. Locals spoke of strange sounds and lights among the ruins, of shadows moving where no one lived. Yet the true haunting was not supernatural. It was the knowledge that 7 people, subjected to months of calculated cruelty, had transformed their suffering into strategy and had struck a blow that echoed far beyond a single property. Today, only a historical marker remains, offering a sanitized account of agricultural development. But beneath the soil and the silence lies the memory of an experiment that revealed a terrible truth. The greatest horrors in American history were not born of madness or myth, but of reason, cold, educated, deliberate. And sometimes, those horrors forged the very resistance that would one day bring the system down. The shadows of the past are never empty. They remember.